The two witnesses of the end times are about to speak. Imagine turning on the news one day and seeing two mysterious figures standing in Jerusalem, performing miracles, calling the world to repentance, and warning of coming judgment. They aren't politicians. They aren't celebrities. They aren't religious leaders we've ever seen before. But here's the catch. These two men have power. Not the kind of power that comes from governments or wealth, but power straight from heaven. Fire comes from their mouths, plagues fall at their command, and for 1,260 days the entire world will watch in awe and in terror. But who are these two witnesses? Why do they appear during the end times? And what happens when the world finally turns against them?
Now, it's interesting that he said that the world will turn against these two. But in actuality, according to the Bible, it will be the Antichrist who will come and finally kill them, for lack of a better term. And I guess you can extrapolate that the world turned against them because at this time frame, this is when the world will start to worship the Antichrist. And so for all those people who are always claiming that this person is the Antichrist and that person is the Antichrist and you the Antichrist and you the Antichrist, well, these two are supposed to come after all these seals and bowls and things have been poured on the earth. And then these two witnesses are going to be speaking. And so the Antichrist has to be here prior to that or in the process of all these things happening. And since none of these things are happening right now, the end time is not near, according to this Bible, which makes it a false prophecy at all times, but because it has consistently and continuously have been a false prophecy. But what I find most interesting about this conversation is that if you ever get a couple of Christians together, ask them who the two witnesses are. You may find that it will be an interesting debate because you will have some that will say that it's Elijah. Others will say, Elijah. Let me rephrase. You will have them say that it is either Elijah, Enoch, or Moses. Three people are usually the primary ones that they'll bring up. And then others will say it is the Jews and the Christians, that it is a metaphor for Christianity and Judaism, one representing the Old Testament, the other representing the New Testament. So that one's a little far-fetched because it doesn't line up actually with the story, because these two individuals have things that they are supposed to do individually, like when people approach them, they spit fire out of their mouths, things of that nature. So it's not necessarily a groups of people or an ideology. So it has to be two people. So we go back to Moses, Elijah, and Enoch. So why do people say this? Well, one, they say it, I'm going to say the best one for last, but one, they say Elijah, because Elijah was a prophet of God, calling down the powers of God, killing all these people, having bears kill these young men, that it will be Elijah because he was taken up with God. He never died. And they will then say Enoch, because according to the Enochian literature and the Genesis, then Genesis says that Enoch was just taken by God and not seen evermore. Probably just wandered out into the desert and got lost and nobody ever saw him. But he never died as well. The reason why most people who believe in this will say that it is those two is because there's a thing that is said in the Bible that the dead know nothing. The dead know absolutely nothing. And it also talks about the fact that Jesus said that no one has gone to heaven. No one. Before him, no one has gone to heaven. Before him and the thieves, no one has went to heaven. Before, as some believe that he went into Abaddon and the bosom of Abraham and cleared that out, that only those who were in the bosom of Abraham would have went up to heaven. But there's a problem with that when you bring Moses into the picture. You see, if you were to read Jude 9, then you will see a confrontation between Michael and the devil. That's right, Satan. Because there's a confrontation over the body of Moses. Now, this is only seen in Jude 9, and many scholars have ideas of where it may have come from. Some of your earlier church fathers like Irenaeus, he is said or have thought to have been quoting from the Book of Assumptions of Moses, which is a lost book to us, that this is where this confirmation comes from for the writer of Jude. But because we have nothing on this book, we can't necessarily say that. But Irenaeus claims that he had this book, just as for him, the Gospels were originally brought to him as the wisdom of the apostles. And then he later gave them the name Mark, Luke, John, and Matthew. So those names didn't come into play until Irenaeus did so in around 182 CE. But it is believed that he had other writings, as many of the people in the first, second, third, fourth century had many writings to which we do not have today because they were considered to be apocryphal or heresy by the Orthodox Roman Church in the fourth century, fifth century. So those things have been destroyed and or lost to time. But the reason why Moses wouldn't fit is because the dead know nothing. But people think that it might be Moses simply because of what is written in Jude 9, because Jude, why else would they be arguing over the body of Moses that supposedly this God buried when Moses died in Deuteronomy, and God buried him because no one knew where he was going to be buried and no one would ever know where he's going to be buried. But somehow the Satan knew where he was going to be buried. Michael knew where he was going to be buried, and therefore they had an argument. I submit to you, if this God is truly God, why is there an argument? Why would Michael need to argue with the Satan as far as where the body of Moses is and who gets that body? You see, some speculate that the Satan was arguing over the body because the Satan was saying that Moses had committed a sin against God by taking the credit and using a stick and hitting a rock and to create water for the people, the Israelites, instead of speaking to the rock as God said so. Others also say that because of all the people who died in Egypt, that it is Moses' fault, not God's fault. And therefore, the sin that Moses had was still upon him. So therefore, his body does not deserve to go into heaven, whereas Michael was pleading for his body or bargaining for his body. Now, why would they be bargaining? The reason is because the Satan in the Old Testament is not the devil. The Satan is more like a prosecutor. You see this as more evident when you are reading the Job story, because the Satan is right there with this God. Now, according to how I was taught Christianity and what I've read about Christianity, it would seem that this God says that evil cannot be wherever he is present. So therefore, how is the Satan the devil? He is not. It's a different role that this B'nai Elohim had in heaven. So he's merely just an officer of the court, similar to a prosecutor in our judicial system here in America. So where is there any other evidence that that may be true? Well, when you look at Zechariah chapter 3, you see that there's a similar situation, kind of like they're just copying each other, where Joshua, the high priest, is standing before the Lord, and to his right is the Satan. And therein they're arguing again, and then the Lord supposedly rebukes the Satan in the same way that the Lord rebukes the Satan when Michael and the Satan are arguing over the body of Moses. Now, if you are supposed to die and go into a new body, a new spirit, a new form, why do you even need the old body of Moses? I want you Christians to also think about that. You're taught today that when you leave, even though this says that your graves will give up their dead and the oceans will give up their dead, and many of you will not die, you will just float up into heaven. Why is your old body needed if you're supposed to have a new body? But yet they needed Moses's body in order for him to either be one of those two witnesses, or after a while, God just said, you know what, Moses, kind of forgive you. So we're going to have a debate amongst the B'nai Elohim as to whether or not your body should be going up into heaven. But I guess you're going to need this body, because according to Revelation, the tree of life will produce fruit in season 12 times a year. So I guess your body needs to be sustained in order to be in this heaven with this God. You see all the fuckery that goes on in this Bible? This is why we deconstruct. Because as soon as you started asking these types of questions, it causes you to realize that these are just stories that were written by people who still thought that God's controlled the weather, and they are not credible. They are not part of your life today, and you should deconstruct from this book. But that is why we did. So always remember, You have to free yourself to be yourself because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibration.